Hello and welcome to Motorsport Extra. We're back once more for a roundup of everything that's been happening in the world of motorsport and a look ahead to what is a very busy couple of weeks of racing action. As ever, it's Ben Evans and Keith Collantine with you. Keith, how have things been since we last spoke?
Hectic, and obviously being right in the middle of back-to-back Formula 1 race weekends and with the Le Mans 24 hours coming up and an awful lot of IndyCar action as well. It's been a very heavy diet of motor racing at the moment. I'm absolutely packed until August.
Yeah, since we spoke, I saw one of the greatest motor races I've ever seen, which was the GT Open race in Paul Ricard, which if you've not seen the last couple of laps, well worth searching out. Thoroughly enjoyed that, and then I've had a couple of weeks off, all things motor racing, which has been quite refreshing in many respects. But we have got plenty to talk about. Let's start with the Canadian Grand Prix, and it was another victory for Lewis Hamilton. Wasn't a great race for Nico Rosberg, and Mercedes' cause was helped somewhat by their main rivals, in this instance Ferrari, throwing the race away.
Kind of a repeat of the Australian Grand Prix in many ways, and I think this will have hurt Ferrari more than they let on, because they really did have a chance to win this one.
Yeah, they did. It was a brilliant start from Sebastian Vettel. Now, to be slightly controversial, for my money, the first corner in Canada has given Lewis Hamilton the world title this year.
It swung things massively back in his favour, definitely. I mean, Rosberg had this 43-point lead 2 races ago, and he's squandered pretty much all of it very, very quickly.
Because it was, we spoke after the Spanish race about, did Rosberg do the right thing to shut the door? Well, for my money, Lewis Hamilton didn't give Nico Rosberg racing room. He ran him off the road. And
as Rosberg did to Hamilton in the same race 2 years earlier.
Yeah, and if I was the championship leader and I knew that this battle was going to keep running all season, if I was Rosberg, I'd have held my line and basically said to Lewis, we can have a crash or you can actually give me the racing room. The fact he backed out, rejoined in 8th, got stuck behind the Force India forever, Lewis Hamilton now knows next time he does that, Rosberg will have the same response.
Did he really back out? I mean, they did make contact going into the corner.
He could have. I'd have still held the line.
You'd have found a way to...
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. But even from that point, it wasn't a given that Hamilton was going to win. And for the first few laps, Vettel looked in a pretty strong position. And that Ferrari, with its new turbo, was within 0.2 of Hamilton in qualifying. That was a pretty good effort. Yeah,
and it's going to make the second half of the championship quite interesting, because actually, for the first time in several seasons now, we've potentially got a Red Bull and a Ferrari that, on merit, are going to be able to compete with the Mercedes.
At the tracks that suit them, I think definitely. I mean, Ferrari, on the quicker tracks, Canada, possibly Baku this weekend, and then moving on, Red Bull ring, they could look good there. Red Bull, conversely, obviously they were so strong at Monaco. Ricciardo, totally on pole on merits. You got to think Hungaroring, Singapore, they're going to be close there. So they're going to cause headaches for Mercedes. You can't really see them being a season-long championship rivals yet, but I think we stand to get some better races and maybe quite a fewer Mercedes 1-2s than we had 12 months ago.
I certainly hope so. And Valtteri Bottas completing the podium, long overdue result. And the Williams team, there is a view they've gone backwards in successive seasons, and this is an important result.
I think at best they've treaded water, and in Formula 1 that is going backwards because everyone develops at such a rate. And I think there's a case to say, well, Williams with the money they've got up against Ferrari and all the rest of it, not having a manufacturer behind them, what else do you expect them to do? But that was a big result for Bottas. He definitely needed that. I think last year Massa was so close to him so often, it kind of undermined Bottas's case as a driver who one of the top manufacturer teams might want to pick up on. But you look back at the last couple of races, Raikkonen was, you have to say, thoroughly indifferent in Canada, even taking into account Ferrari's strategy blunder, more of which in a moment. He was not at all good in Monaco. He binned the car about a dozen laps in. And there's Bottas, the only driver other than Hamilton who made that one-stop strategy work, and it really brought Williams into contention. Always been a bit of a Montreal specialist, Bottas.
Yeah, and I mean, the Raikkonen conundrum continues. You've got to think P45 time, because you read a lot about Formula 1 trading wars, there not being openings for drivers. Actually, if you were really brave at Ferrari, do you put somebody in for the second half of the season? Question mark.
Well, it's what Red Bull chose to do, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And you have to say, if you're Ferrari, winning the Constructors' Championship is of no interest to you. You don't need the extra money because you get all the extra money from Eccleston just for showing up and being Ferrari. So why not do it? To answer my own question, I think you would not do it because you wouldn't want to potentially upset or maybe destabilise Vettel, who's obviously pretty solid and secure and happy in that team. And I tend to think Ferrari, although they've definitely got 2 world champions, maybe still there's an element there of the Ferrari of old of building themselves more around one driver than having the 2 best they can get their hands on.
At the same time, I would still consider plugging somebody in once the championship's definitively out of reach. Plug somebody in for a few races, see what happens.
It would be a pretty harsh verdict on Raikkonen. You have to keep in mind, of course, as well, they've already cut Raikkonen's contract short once, but then maybe that begs the question,
yeah,
why
but
hire him back?
In a weekend where Formula One's got a new alcohol sponsor, you'd have thought there'd have been something to elevate his game. Talking of things that don't look happy and stable, that Renault looks like an absolute dog to drive.
Certainly did in Canada, and you have to say they've had 2 consecutive crashes now, because Palmer had his big one in Monaco and Magnussen had a pretty big smash in final practice, and that was a pretty hard hit. No, when you consider that the Red Bull has got the same engine in there and you look at how much performance Red Bull are getting with the same power unit, there is an absolutely huge amount of ground for Renault to make up. But you come back to the fact that car was basically not developed throughout all of last year, and Lotus even made an appearance on Can't Pay Will Take It Away on Channel 4 when the Lone Guys came around.
Yeah,
Channel 5, I correct myself.
Can't say I've ever seen it.
I've only seen that one episode, and it was quite an eye-opener.
Yeah, can well imagine. Well, we have got, as you alluded to earlier, the double header. Probably by the time you've listened to this, your track action certainly will have been underway in Baku. The race may have taken place as well. It's going to be different, if nothing else. It seems to be a very odd circuit.
Yeah, I think it's going to tend towards a one-stop strategy, definitely, you would say that, because it's going to be low grip, and Pirelli have gone conservative with the tyre allocation. I mentioned that up top because it might not immediately be obvious to the Ferrari pit wall, who made their massive blunder with Vettel, which I think perhaps get into a little bit briefly. A lot of people were surprised by that one, and that's why, coming straight into this, I said it was a bit of a repeat of Australia, because, once again, one of Mercedes' rivals surrendering the advantage of track position over the silver cars. Why would you give that up so easily? In the case of Ferrari, obviously they had this virtual safety car period, and they reasoned that the safety car period was going to go on long enough for them to bring both their drivers in and get them stopped. In the event, they didn't get either of them done in the time, and I think they probably should have been able to see that coming, because well, Ben, we sit there in the commentary box every now and then, there's a safety car period, and our producer gets in our ear and says, how long do you think this safety car period is going to last? Do you think we've got to have time for an advert break? And we'll try and make a call on it. And you looked at why the virtual safety car had been called. There was Button's car stopped at the side of the track, no damage, right next to an access point, easily able to move. That safety car period was never going to last very long, and sure enough, after 63 seconds, it was over. So it was surprising that they didn't cancel the call for Vettel to come in, and astonishing that they didn't cancel the call for Raikkonen to come in, which completely ruined his race.
Yeah, it was... I sometimes just think with Formula One strategy, they overthink it and don't actually respond to what's going on.
It's Monaco again.
Right in front of them. Well, Baku would be interesting. If nothing else, if you've ever visited the website Sniff Petrol and read the fictional Formula One columnist Trentham Sleeves, worth reading some of those and then looking at certain Formula One journalist tweets from the last 24 hours is all I will say.
What interested me about Baku was back when the race was first announced was Flavio Briatore saying it was an F1 kind of place. Not the kind of endorsement you want from not the kind of person you want giving that kind of endorsement. No,
and it's certainly another run on sort of the... there is a view that says Formula One has not got a spotless history in where it staged some of its races. They clung on in apartheid era South Africa for longer than pretty much any other sport. They raced in Spain under Franco, so it's not new territory to go to countries that have maybe got a slightly dubious human rights record. I think what is different is the shamelessness with which the sport colludes with some of those regimes to promote an image.
I think sometimes Eccleston delights in, provoking that kind of thing because he knows that he can get away with it. I do wonder what it does for some sponsors who maybe don't want to get involved because of those reasons, and it's the sort of thing that is never really going to come out because they'll just never consider getting involved in F1 in the first place.
Maybe now is a good time to talk about the Heineken deal, actually, because one of the points I was going to make around that fits exactly with the point that you've just made, which is the way that the sport is currently configured, the places it goes and races. There are only a certain type of brand that are going to be wanting to be involved. And, for example, a very high revenue brand around ethical food might not want to be associated with a sport that races in some of the places that it does. And therefore that does actually close off some of the organisations that are going to be involved. I
think the other interesting aspect to the Heineken deal is how this mirrors what we were in, go back a decade or so, with tobacco sponsorship. And for quite a few years with tobacco sponsorship, the writing was on the wall. You knew it was going to get banned, and Formula 1 clung on in there. Obviously, there are similar moves afoot now with alcohol sponsorship, and it's starting to look inevitable that in a few years down the line, some countries are going to ban that as well. But if you think back to the tobacco era, I remember Eccleston going on all the time, if Europe bans tobacco advertising, and at the time it was the European Union that was kind of leading the way, that doesn't matter. We've got all these other races out in the Middle East and all the rest of it. That doesn't work with alcohol because actually quite a few of the new race venues, alcohol sponsorship is already not allowed. And furthermore, I think there's a specific problem as far as Formula 1 goes linking to alcohol, which is drink driving. Nobody really cared about the problem of drink smoking. It's very hard to smoke when you've got a full-face crash helmet on. But drink driving, I think there's a clear line of criticism that you can have against alcohol being connected to motor racing.
Yeah, to present the counter-argument, alcohol sponsorship has been in Formula 1 for a very, very long time, and didn't raise maybe the questions that it is prompting now. In the past, you had Cronenberg, who's on a LaRouche, you had Lauenbrau on a McLaren on occasion.
Like the Martini cars going back to the 70s.
You had Mum, who the champagnes provider. Foster's had a very similar deal to the one that Heineken have got, that went unnoticed for years. Admittedly, these have the tragic side effect. My brother, once in a Formula 1 hospitality, drinking underage several pints of that fair beverage and passing out and missing a qualifying session. But
at least that was the only thing that happened.
And we're not going to share that with anybody. That's absolutely secret. Please leave that in. And I think the other thing I'd say is that Heineken, as somebody who's a huge fan of rugby, transformed the European Cup competition, the Heineken Cup. And most brands, I'd be very cynical, are they going to actually bring something to the sport? I think Heineken can, because they have done it successfully with other sports and have invested money very cannily that have given maximum exposure to the sport and the brand. The other thing I'd also say is that this podcast absolutely will accept alcohol advertising, either in cash or in kind, unless it's Carling.
I also wonder whatever happened to Johnny Walker as Formula One's official whiskey. That was announced to great fanfare a few years ago, and then it completely went silent. Oh, I think at the time McLaren and FOM were jockeying for their money, and a lot of people were expecting the Johnny Walker logos to vanish off the McLarens.
Yeah, well, there was certainly part of me that wondered, because embargoes got broken around this particular deal, whether or not it would actually ever materialise.
You do wonder when these things come out and they get leaked beforehand, and certainly there were some red faces about that one.
Mind you, the shamelessness with which I've seen certain grandees in the sport posing with a certain bottle of beer really makes me hope that Durex consider re-entering the sport.
Not before time.
Moving across to the United States, because it's been a very busy time for the world of IndyCar, because they had the duel in Detroit immediately after the Indianapolis 500. Then they travelled the length of the country for the Texas 600, or
part of it,
Texas 72 laps, most of which were under pace car last weekend. I mean, the place to start probably is the absolutely miraculous escape for Joseph Newgarden.
That was a real shocker, and it was one of those crashes where, sometimes a driver has a crash and you think, oh, that's terrible, and sometimes you have a crash which unfolds before you and you can see what's about to happen, and it's really quite sickening, because he was obviously for quite a while sliding along the track, obviously heading roll hoop first towards the barrier. given the nature of the crash, his injuries, which I think were limited to a fracture to his shoulder and a fracture to his wrist, were astonishingly light.
Part of, I think, what bothers me about IndyCar crashes more than others is the drivers do so much to connect with the fans. You really care about the individual
Absolutely,
in the car.
I know, I agree
when
completely.
an accident like that's happening. And Joseph Newgarden, somebody I've worked with when he raced in the United Kingdom and interviewed him several times, and you just really worry when you see the car sliding along like that.
It is the particular nature of a track like Texas. This does get asked a lot. Is it too dangerous for IndyCar? Because it has the very, very high steeped banking, and it has that nature of the slightly dented oval shape that they use particularly for NASCAR racing, where if you have that kind of crash where you go hard against the barrier, there's a very strong chance you're going to have a secondary impact further down the line.
Yeah, there's part of me that thinks actually high-speed ovals under modern safety standards are too dangerous.
Even
for
Indy.
I would not be surprised if we got into a situation in a couple of years' time where you had Indy as the sole oval on the IndyCar schedule.
Well, you have to say from a point of view of the tickets that they're able to sell, wouldn't be a huge surprise. I mean, even Texas, which has been a long-standing race, back when this was the Indy Racing League, when it first split from CART, when they started putting their oval schedule together. It was one of the early ones they've had on. It's one of the ones that's remained there year after year, and for a while it even held 2 rounds, I think, at Texas. But it has always been a worry. And of course, when CART tried to race there in 2001, because their cars were so much more powerful, they went basically too fast for the circuit. All the drivers started to have blackouts and have these enormous crashes, so they couldn't race there at all. IndyCar, with their slightly higher downforce cars than they had previously, they're not far off that level of performance, certainly not close enough for blackouts to be a problem, and I'm sure they're very alert to that potential problem, but they still are, very, very quick cars for that kind of track.
In terms of the championship, though, Simon Pagenaud, he has extended his points lead coming out of Detroit. Obviously, no points awarded yet for Texas because the race hasn't finished yet.
Yes, and this creates a very interesting situation where we could see James Hinchcliffe leading 2 races at once at some point over the next couple of months.
There is a large part of me that would like what happened on Sunday to be scrubbed and they start again.
Well, this was one of the tweets that Eddie Gossage, the boss at Texas Motor Speedway, was promoting, because obviously they had these 72 laps. From lap 43 on, it was completely under caution. So, slightly more than half of what they did run was competitive mileage. And I don't think he was coming down on either side of that, but you could see the case in point, particularly from fans who, travelled a long way to get there and then go and couldn't necessarily come back, just to say, why not just start afresh?
And also, for Joseph Newgarden and Conor Daly, their sponsors will have a race weekend with no exposure. I mean, well, they will, because they'll be replaying that crash ad infinitum probably, but
there's not an awful lot of the sponsors' logos left on Newgarden's car at the end of that crash.
And I think, because I've been involved in race meetings where there have been make-up rounds from previous cancellations, and it can be really odd because you get to a point in the season where you've got different deals that have been done, and you've got 10 cars sat in the paddock not getting to race because they weren't entered 6 months previously.
It would be odd to have those teams show up and obviously, Newgarden and Daly just to be standing around, not playing any part in what, for the most part feels like a new race, because there is still much of the race distance left to be run.
What we'll try and do, though, if they are not allowed to race, we'll see if one or the other of them wants to join us for the BT Sport commentary for that one.
Yeah, absolutely. We just go back to Detroit for a moment, because that was an interesting pair of races. I was commentating through the second one, and as you said, Pagenaud had pole for both of those, didn't manage to win either of them, but still managed to extend his points lead, and that's why, to me, it's just looking utterly inevitable that he's going to take the title this year, because whatever happens to him, he still manages to take points off his rivals, and assuming that Texas is going to continue as it is at the moment, Dixon once again had got unlucky. He picked up a load of debris from the Newgarden crash. Unlucky, obviously, in the context of not being unlucky enough to actually have the crash. But even so, it was another setback for the guy who's closest to Pagenaud, and it just seems that the second place in the championship is cursed at the moment.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting now that we head to a series of road and street courses again. Road America, then Toronto, then Mid-Ohio. Again, it can all start to change. The only other bit of racing to bring up to speed with is we have the World Touring Car Championship at the Moscow Raceway.
And a double win for Lauda. There's something I never thought I'd say.
And what a surprise after Marquin Hart took a win for China in the Chinese round for Lauda touring at the Moscow Raceway.
Yeah, they had quite a lot less weight on, I think, than Citroën. I know for the next round in Portugal, they're going to be 10 kilos lighter than the Citroëns. I think there was something in the region of 30 kilos lighter, possibly more, in Moscow.
Great. Lovely track as well. So let's move on to the news. And I guess we start with the very sad news, the passing of Louis Salom at the Catalan Moto Grand Prix after an absolutely terrible crash in free practice in the Moto 2 class. And it was, having seen footage of the crash, it was one of those instances where on many, many occasions riders have walked away. He was just unfortunate enough the bike struck him.
You know motorbike racing a lot better than I do, so I'm not obviously going to comment on the crash other than to say it's a terrible thing when this happens in any scenario, and to have a one rider or one driver crash like that, have that kind of outcome is a bit surprising, and it puts you in mind of the ever-present question of bike, car, circuit safety, and this particular problem that a lot of circuits are having to grasp at the moment in terms of how do we make our tracks safe for both cars and bikes. And it was interesting to me that in the wake of it, they switched to using the F1 layout of the track.
The piece I'd direct you to is Matt Oxley, who writes Motorsport Magazine, wrote a fantastic piece about this whole debate, and his main point was that the accident with Louis Salom is probably the first time in decades where a Moto GP rider has been killed in something other than a freak incident or a multi-bike racing incident where tragically these things happen. And he points back to Tajiro Kato in 2003 at Suzuka as the last time where this sort of incident has taken place. Because
motorbike riders are always going to be susceptible to coming off the bike, and then you're vulnerable to other bikes.
Exactly. And it's a bizarre one because in the immediate aftermath there was a lot of anti-tarmac runoff sentiment, but then a lot of the tarmac runoff, certainly at the Parabolica in Monza, was put there at the behest of the motorbike riders because the gravel track was causing the bikes to start bouncing, it was causing the risers to bounce and land awkwardly. And it's really, there is no easy answer. If you come off a motorbike at 160 miles an hour, it's likely to have quite an unfortunate consequence. So, other news, I've got here Sorrell and Eccleston. What's your talking point?
This really caught my eye. The rising profile of Martin Sorrell in terms of Formula 1 management. They ran an interview with him on their website a couple of weeks ago, where he was basically laying out a kind of a vision, as he sees it, for the future of Formula 1, which in some ways differs from the sort of standard line that we've heard from Eccleston. And this interested me for two reasons. First of all, because it's unusual to hear anyone from within Formula 1 Group who isn't Eccleston talking about, where's the sport going? How are we going to make money out of this in the future? How is it going to develop the future broadcasting? What tracks they go to? The whole picture. And also sort of shoring up him as a figure with an F1 past, and talking about how, one line that's kept coming up is his presence at the Monaco Grand Prix back when Jackie Stewart was racing there and all the rest of it. So that in itself is interesting, but also to me, the fact that this is the second time he's popped up in this context this year, because a couple of months ago he did an interview with Eccleston at an event in London, an advertising event, and this was an hour up on the stage in front of the cameras, generated a lot of publicity, and it does kind of make you think in terms of what is going to happen post-Eccleston. What are Formula 1 Group's plans? What are Eccleston's plans? What figures may come to the fore? And I think those two things taken together does make you, I think it's been positioned in such a way as to make us think Martin Sorrell is one of these names who's being lined up in that way.
Yeah, and for Bernie Eccleston, I'm sure there's a degree of wanting to anoint a successor and manage that transition, because you certainly take the view that Christian Horner and Toto Wolff, two of the other names that get bandied around a lot, are probably not suitable because of vested interests.
I think also Ferrari are reported to have a power of veto over who can move in this regard, and the chances of a guy from one of their top rival teams getting the gig is something they definitely wouldn't want to see. And of course, Montezemolo is also on the F1 board.
Yeah, very few things Ferrari don't seem to get. If I was to throw some names at it, I would say Jonathan Palmer would be a very strong candidate if you wanted somebody steeped in the sport as a driver,
solid,
as a circuit
very
owner,
solid business background,
and promoter, and knows the business inside out. Also, likewise, Alan Gow from the British Touring Car Championship. Those are the sort of people I would be looking to maybe go a bit left field, people who've been ringmasters, who understand all the politics, and might well be able to step up.
But equally recently, Montezemolo, in between having one of his latest whinges about, the cars aren't fast or loud enough, was espousing the view that whoever steps in place of Eccleston, it may well have to be multiple people, and that is definitely a scenario which I think is realistic. A figurehead, but also a couple of other guys, to get jobs done in different areas.
Would be, license for chaos.
And
it leads us...
So very little will change.
Indeed. It leads us in nicely. You put out a call on Twitter for questions. We will have Grammar Corner for everybody who did a like and a retweet rather than a question. But we had a very good question from Pete Richardson, which is, should celebrities be doing interviews?
I don't think that was his question, was it?
That was one of them, and that's the one that got me excited, because you cannot have enough of people who know nothing about motor racing talking to winners on the podium.
It certainly always warms the cockles of my heart. And when Max Verstappen had that amazing shock win at the Circuit de Catalunya, and he was then up in front of Placido Domingo answering all kinds of meandering, rambling drivel, I certainly wasn't throwing my shoes at the television.
I think the thing is, it should be reciprocal, because if you want to have a movie star come and interrupt my Grand Prix, then I want Kimi Raikkonen to be presenting the Oscars. I think people have learned quite quickly. People should state what they're good at after that.
Well, talking about celebrities connecting to Formula 1, though, recently, I saw Red Bull have had Lindsey Vonn driving one of their... actually, it was a Formula Renault 3.5, now a Formula V8 3.5 car at the Red Bull Ring. Yeah,
and that's kind of cool. And I quite like it when you see a celebrity who's prepared to step up and
actually have a go.
And actually have a go. So that's positive. The question I think that you were alluding to is, does Formula 1 try too hard to make itself popular?
Yeah, and that's a difficult one to answer, and I think I said to Pete on Twitter, that's an essay question kind of question, because I think to an extent it's inevitable that it has to, because we live in the real world. Formula 1's a huge business, and we've all seen what's happening to the television figures at the moment. Off the top of my head, I think there was 600 million in 2008, and there were 400 million last year. Obviously, some of that will have gone because people are watching online legally, and those figures can be traced. Some of that will be gone because some people are watching online illegally, and those figures can't be traced. But I also think there's probably a substantial number of people who just aren't watching anymore. And the question is where those numbers are going. And I think Formula 1 does realistically have to address that. But in terms of, is it trying too hard to be popular? The problem I always have when I think about this is I find it hard to separate the things that annoy me about Formula 1 from what do I really think is holding it back. I can't stand DRS. Is it actually hurting F1's popularity? I honestly don't know. I really couldn't tell you. I think for dedicated fans like myself, it's a big turn-off, but we probably keep watching anyway. For the casual fans, maybe they don't even notice it's there.
I think it's also overarching all of it is there's too many other things to do now on a Sunday afternoon.
That's definitely a huge competing factor.
Having spoken with promoters in the sport in Europe, they cite that as really the number one issue. That now you've got shops open on a Sunday, you've got many television channels available. There are other things for people to do. Whereas actually, if you go even 20 years ago and you look back on the halcyon days of the 1990s, actually most people in the United Kingdom had 4 television channels. The other 3 were showing pretty terrible programming, so you watched the Grand Prix because the shops were shut and there was nothing else to do.
Yeah, pretty much. But I also think that there's another way of looking at this question. Does Formula 1 take its popularity problem seriously enough? I would answer that with a no, because I think you look at some of the things that have happened recently, the readiness with which it went for things like double points, or this stupid elimination qualifying system, which was only ever going to fail and lasted 2 races, which were 2 races longer than it should have done. These are symptoms of a sport that realizes it's got problems, but isn't handling them in an intelligent, critical way. It's just coming up with knee-jerk, this will fix it, and throwing out these ideas that then completely bomb. So I think there's something to be said for, it realizes it's got a popularity problem, but it doesn't attack it properly.
Yeah. Yes, I completely agree. And I don't think Formula One has quite got to the root cause of what's not making it popular.
And I do think it's a hard question to answer. And Formula One is a very complex product. I always think, something like football, obviously I'm not really a football fan. It's a pretty simple idea to sell. It's 22 guys kicking a ball around. Formula One, you've got cutting edge car design, you've got the sporting element of it, you've got, the entertainment question mark element of it, the business element of it is always going to be huge. Balancing all those things out isn't easy. And, it does get things wrong sometimes, and I do criticize it, and I think that's correct. But you should also appreciate this is a very complex sport.
And you've hit the nail on the head for me. It is too complicated for most people to follow. The races are devastatingly complex. And you've got the strategy, you've got different types of tyres, you've got DRS, you've got this, that, and the other. And it just becomes a little bit of a headache. And it becomes a headache for me. And with the strategy, and I've said it before, if people really wanted to see cars in the pits, there'd be grandstands outside QuickFit every weekend. People want to see cars going quickly on the track and racing wheel to wheel on the track. And they don't want DRS. You want cars that have got an aero package that means they can actually race. Overtaking is possible. It's not easy, but it's possible.
No, I tend to agree with that. I mean, this is my position, as a long-term, passionate fan of the sport. I've been watching F1 for, since 1989. And yeah, that is basically how I see it as well. I think that would sell. And I also think we're in this unfortunate situation now where, because the popularity is a problem, it's a constant subject of debate, and it's always been talked about in the TV commentaries. And again, I'm not criticizing the journalists or commentators or the media as a whole, because it's obviously a talking point. But the very fact that it's become a problem means it feeds into itself. Not always in a very healthy way.
No easy answers, I think, is the answer to that question. So let's have a little bit of look ahead. And again, by the time that you listen to this, the race may well be underway or will have finished. The Le Mans 24 Hours this weekend. Keith, what are your thoughts on the Le Mans 24 Hours?
I can't wait. It's always one of my absolute favourite races. And as we record this at the moment, qualifying 1 was yesterday, qualifying 2 is about to happen. Obviously, who actually gets on pole doesn't really decide an awful lot, but just getting to, watching the cars, seeing them at night, all lit up, it's just amazing. But what's got me interested for this year's race, I think there's one interesting point around this year's race that I've not seen much discussion of, and that is that while the field has increased in size, we've gone up from 56 cars to 60 this year, that in itself is great to see, but up at the front, the LMP1 field has really shrunk. We've gone down from 14 cars to just 9. And I think there's a couple of things there. Obviously, a big part of that reduction is because of Nissan, and let's be realistic, they were never lapping at LMP1 speeds to begin with. But it's a real pity that, after their effort with their radical car didn't work out last year, they didn't just think, okay, let's build something a bit more conventional and come back and have a crack at it. They sort of, and I didn't really like this at all, quietly put out this press release over Christmas when no one was paying attention. I think it was like the 23rd of December or something, just saying, we're not coming back to Le Mans next year. I thought that was a really poor end to that. So they're not back. And obviously then, the traffic situation for the LMP1 drivers is going to be incredibly fierce. And I just hope that we start to see a bit more competition at the sharp end for LMP1. I did see today the ACO have announced in their wisdom that the LMP1 non-manufacturer, non-hybrid cars are going to be allowed to have a drag reduction system for 2018. You can probably imagine what my opinion of that is.
I understand it's dynamic aero and not a drag DRS.
Right.
But quite what that means, I don't know.
It basically means they're so much slower than the LMP1 hybrids, and who can be surprised at that? Let's give them an artificial boost so they can catch up.
And what I hope is that we get through this year without a very large accident. My worry, somebody who commentates on GT racing quite a lot, is there's quite a few drivers in the field I've not heard of. And
wow, in any field, Ben, that amazes me, with your encyclopedic knowledge of British Formula Ford and Formula 3 over the years.
And so that makes me nervous, because I think this is probably the only global showpiece sporting event where you can buy your way in any field. So if I won Euro Millions, I couldn't buy my place at Euro 2016 to play for England. I might do a better job than Wayne Rooney, but I couldn't buy my way in.
Who?
I couldn't buy my way into Wimbledon to play tennis there, but I could get myself onto the grid at Le Mans 24 Hours within about 12 months of taking up motorsport. And so that always scares me slightly.
It is, yeah, a concern. And when you talk about, the field size getting bigger, and you look at where this growth has come from, it has come predominantly from the classes which have amateur/gentlemen drivers, gentlewomen drivers in some cases perhaps as well.
Also,
but, sorry, go on.
No, I was going to move on from Le Mans 24 Hours.
Okay, I've got loads on Le Mans, if that's all right with you.
Go for it.
No, I was one of the things that really caught my eye, though, was the Garage 56 entry for this year, which previously has been given over to alternatively fueled cars, electric cars. They tried to have the hydrogen car a couple of years ago, which didn't work. But this year is an LMP2 car, which has been adapted so that a quadruple amputee called Frederick Saucette can drive it. This is an absolutely amazing story. I must admit, in my horrible, cynical, jaded way, when I first heard about, here's a racing driver who'd lost his limbs, I thought, oh, he must have had a crash. He actually had a disease called, I've got it written down here, and I'm sure I'm going to pronounce it wrong, purpura fulminans, which is an absolutely horrific sounding illness, something you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. It's basically a flesh-eating bacteria, which led to him having most of his arms and legs amputated. And they basically winch him into the car. He's got a special seat made up, which has pedals and so on set up so that he can manipulate them with what he has of his limbs. And he has to have things like a gas canister ejector seat to help him get out of the car in the mandatory minimum time for getting out of the car. The reason that the car gets a sort of Garage 56 dispensation is because of those alterations, and because it also has things like ABS, because obviously he hasn't got the power in the legs he hasn't got to operate the brake pedal. But that's an amazing story, and I really, really hope that car's still running at the end of the 24.
Yeah, it's a fantastic use of that dispensation, and long may it continue.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. But what do you make of the fact that for the first time, we're going to go back to F1 a bit here, first time in 5 years, Formula 1 has scheduled a race to clash it? And do we think it has anything to do with the fact that an active F1 driver went there last year and won?
Yeah, no comment for legal reasons. What disappointed me slightly, and what will be interesting going forward, is if an active F1 driver decides to do Le Mans over a Grand Prix.
I don't think that will ever happen. I will say that right now. I think contractually, I can't see that happening.
I'm not so sure.
Yeah.
If you have a Formula 1 team who have got a sponsor that's common with Le Mans, and that sponsor would rather have your F1 driver win Le Mans 24 Hours, it could happen.
Yeah, I'm not particularly convinced, but maybe. But I do think it is. I do think it was put there specifically so that we wouldn't get more F1 drivers, because I think Le Mans did very well out of that last year. I thought it really threw a bit more light on it, and it did have lead a few F1 journalists to go over there and write about the race and compare it perhaps not entirely favourably with F1.
And also, it's no coincidence as well. One could argue that the Formula E season finale also clashes with the Grand Prix, because that didn't last year, and there was a similar effect.
Although the Formula E season finale very nearly didn't happen this year. But,
that's true.
But anyway, very much looking forward to Le Mans. I understand that rain is forecast for the start of the race, so that will really throw things up.
Well, in the interest of time, shall we move on to the next round of the IndyCars, Road America, which is a very overdue return to the circuit, and the exciting or terrible news, depending on your view, is that you and I will be commentating on the whole race for British television.
It's great for you and me.
Absolutely wonderful. Also a very good opportunity for anybody at home to test the mute button on their remote.
But I'm really interested, because we were having a back and forth about this on Twitter, and I didn't quite catch where this conversation led us. When was the last time we had a British commentary team doing a full commentary in IndyCar race? I think we ended up with it being more than a decade ago.
Yes, certainly Eurosport had a British commentary team in the late days of Champ Car, so 2006-ish. I remember watching the IndyCar race on the BBC from Rockingham, and again, that wasn't the American commentary team. I think it's probably worth picking up why we're doing this, because it is an absolute technical nightmare for us to do the brake filling that we currently do on BT Sport. And when we're doing the races, we get a large proportion of the comments we get back say, we'd like to have a go with British commentators doing the whole race, we're doing this as an experiment. We hope it works. We hope you like it. If it really doesn't work, we can go back to the American countries. We're just trying it out to see if it works.
Yeah, and there are a lot of things that we won't really know until we get in there and try it, such as, how are we going to be able to incorporate feedback from the pits, other information that comes out to the teams, and all the rest of that. It is a little bit suck it and see.
But also, there is a statement of intent here between the UK broadcast partners for IndyCar, because if they see there's a British commentary team doing the races, they may well say, come out to some of the events, do it on site for us. And that's surely got to be something to aspire to. We want to do the very, very best coverage possible for UK fans. The ad-free stuff we've done is brilliant. It's a step forward from where we were.
And we were thrilled to get the opportunity to do that much.
We know it can be done a bit better. But it was lovely on holiday to have lots of people telling me I was a terrible commentator on Twitter. It was absolutely brilliant. Also, next weekend, we've got the return of the Formula V8 3.5s to Paul Ricard. And they've had 6 different winners in 6 races so far. They're probably due a dry weekend. I expect late June in Paul Ricard they'll get one.
Yeah, that's looking a bit better for them. Tom Dillman doing really nicely in that championship. But you could see one of the others taking a bit of a run at him. Vaxivière, if he's got that car sorted now, I'd definitely have a look at him. And he was so fired up in the French round last year, which obviously wasn't at Paul Ricard, it was at Le Mans Bugatti. I think he will be right up at the hot end.
Yeah, it was very nice to be at Spa to see those cars. They are amazing in the flesh, absolutely amazing in the flesh. It was also very nice to be in race control to overhear an absolutely blazing row between one of the drivers and the race director after qualifying. Shows that the passions are running high. I'm
sure I couldn't possibly work out who that was.
They may have had a crash in race 2 that was quite a big one. Also, on next weekend to close, there's the DTM and European F3 at the Norris Ring.
Now, there is a track I love. It's such a weird one. And I actually found that track by mistake once. I was on a school trip to Berlin or Munich or somewhere, and we took a trip out to the Nuremberg to see the rally the Nazi rally grounds. And we were walking around there, and I hadn't actually heard of the Norris Ring at this time, and I'm looking at the pavement, and then I realised there was grid hatchings on the floor. So this is a racing track. I was so excited.
Germany's got a fine track record in absolutely bonkers street circuits.
Absolutely. Avis.
Yeah. We could probably do a special on mad German street circuits. If you ever get a chance to pick up the reviews of the DTM from the early 1990s, some of the Wunstorf and some Diepholz, some of the
Diepholz, that's the one I was trying to think of. Crazy old airfield circuit. Brilliant.
Absolutely brilliant. So
makes Baku look a bit tame. Although, some of the F1 drivers are a bit concerned about Baku.
You're an F1 driver to an extent. Get on with it. That's maybe a slightly blunt assessment. Well, we've got lots and lots of racing to look forward to over the next couple of weeks. We will be back, I think, the week after next. And as ever, do get your questions and comments in on Twitter at BenCommentator, at Keith Collantine. Apologies if we've been a bit all over the place today. It's been a pretty rough week in the UK news-wise, and there is a lot of hateful rhetoric going on around a referendum at the moment, which is proving to be very, very depressing. So that's it for this week. We will enjoy your racing, and we'll talk again very soon.